Hi everyone! Tonight's video is an introduction to photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process where plants and some protists and bacteria use the energy in sunlight to make organic carbon molecules. So where does photosynthesis fit into the energy cycle on Earth? Well, let's start here with the ATP cycle, which was covered in a previous video. In the ATP cycle, we have ATP, which has 3 phosphates, and I have 3 phosphates on the end that have very unstable bonds because those negative charges repel each other. If one of those phosphates from ATP is placed on another molecule, by benefit of the fact that the phosphate has negative charges, it will change the shape of that other molecule, allowing it to do work. So there is an energy transfer. But when ATP loses a phosphate, that generates ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. That ADP needs to have another phosphate put onto it to regenerate ATP, which is cellular money. The process of putting the phosphate back on the ADP is what is done by aerobic respiration, where glucose and oxygen are broken down into CO2 and H2O, which gives the energy to put the phosphate back on ADP to form ATP. But we know it's not that simple. That involves glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. But then how do we get the CO2 and H2O back together to make glucose and oxygen? And that is the process of photosynthesis that I am going to introduce tonight. So what organisms perform aerobic respiration? Those are our heterotrophs. They have to eat their food. And the organisms that perform photosynthesis are autotrophs because they can make their own food. They can make their own organic carbon. What organelle is responsible for photosynthesis? Well, that is our chloroplast, pictured here. So the chloroplast is a very complex structure. There are 3 membranes. Starting from the innermost membrane, there are the thylakoid membranes, and that is these looks like a stack of pancakes in the most inner part of the chloroplast. Then we have what's called the inner membrane going around here, and then finally the outer membrane. So there's 3 membranes, the thylakoid membrane, the inner, and the outer membrane. There's also 3 spaces in a chloroplast. There is the lumen, which is the inside of the thylakoid membrane, so we could call this the thylakoid lumen or the thylakoid space. There's the stroma, which is this space where the thylakoid membranes are located. And then there's also the intermembrane space in between the outer and inner membrane. You should be able to label a chloroplast with all the membranes and all the spaces. So why are chloroplasts green? You can see here in a light microscope, such as we have in the classroom, these blobs here are chloroplasts, and they are the part of the plant that is green. The rest of the plant cell might look slightly green only from reflected light. The chloroplasts are actually the only green parts of the cell. It's because they have a photosynthetic pigment called chlorophyll. Now it's important to differentiate that chlorophyll is a photosynthetic pigment. All pigments are colored, but not all pigments are able to capture energy from light. Photosynthetic pigments are not only colored, but they're able to capture energy from light. So chlorophyll is a photosynthetic pigment. There's actually many different photosynthetic pigments that have many different colors, but chlorophyll is what gives chloroplasts their green color, and it's the most common photosynthetic pigment. Photosynthetic pigments are located in a structure called a photosystem in the thylakoid membrane. So let's look at why chloroplasts are green, why chlorophyll is green. If we look here, we have what's called an absorption spectrum. So on the x-axis is the wavelength of light, which corresponds to a color of visual light, and on the y-axis is absorbance, how much of this light is absorbed. There are 2 forms of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Both forms of chlorophyll absorb light in the 400, close to 500 wavelength light, and that corresponds to blue. They also absorb light between 600 and 700 nanometers of light, and that corresponds to the yellow and reds. So the only light wavelengths that chlorophyll does not absorb is this 500 to 600 nanometer range, which corresponds to green light. So chlorophylls absorb red and blue light, but they reflect green light. So that's why chloroplasts are green, and that's why most plants are green. So again, chlorophyll is the most common photosynthetic pigments, and it's why most plants have green leaves. But of course there are plants with red leaves, and that's because they have a different photosynthetic pigment that absorbs light in the green wavelength and reflects light in the red wavelength. Let's look at the balanced reaction for photosynthesis. 6 CO2s plus 6 H2O forms 1 glucose molecule and 6 O2. You'll note that this is exactly the reverse of the balanced reaction for cellular respiration. But this is not actually an accurate representation of what happens, and I don't know why high school biology curriculum always have students memorize this reaction when it isn't really what happens. What actually happens is you do have carbon dioxide and water coming together with lots and lots of ATP and lots of electrons, and they don't form glucose at all. The process of photosynthesis forms an organic 3-carbon sugar called G3P. And then it does produce oxygen, and again, more water. Water is actually on both sides of the equation. So in order to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars, plants need electrons and ATP, and they need a lot of these. Where do plants get the energy to make ATP and to extricate electrons from their bonds to get these electrons that they need to make G3P? Well, they get that energy from the sun. The ultimate source of energy on the earth is the sun. Without the sun, there would be no life on earth. So plants perform photosynthesis in 2 phases. The first phase is called the light-dependent reactions, and these occur in the thylakoid membrane. The light-dependent reactions produce ATP, and they place electrons from water on an electron holder called NADPH. The light-independent reactions occur in the stroma, and the light-independent reactions use the electrons and the ATP that was produced in the light reactions to convert CO2 into an organic sugar, G3P, not glucose. Now it's important to note that the light-independent reactions can also be called the Calvin cycle. These are interchangeable terms. So what you should know from this video: you should be able to label the spaces and the membranes of a chloroplast. You should know the difference between ordinary pigments and photosynthetic pigments. You should know what colors of light chlorophyll absorbs and which colors it reflects, and why is it green. You should know the balanced reaction for photosynthesis and why it's wrong. You should know the 2 phases of photosynthesis and where each one occurs and what is produced in each phase. The other thing you should really understand is where chlorophyll is located in the plant. So that's all for tonight.